When mountain man Caleb Morrison finds a bruised woman washing bloodstains by the creek, he offers her something her violent husband never could a chance to discover, that her worth isn't measured by the sons she couldn't bear. But will Margaret find the courage to abandon everything she's known for a stranger's promise of freedom in the untamed Wyoming Territory of 1867? The crack of splitting wood echoed across the frozen valley like a gunshot, making Margaret jump so hard she nearly dropped the coffee pot. Outside their cabin in the Wyoming Territory, her husband Edmund swung his axe with the fury of a man fighting ghosts, each blow landing harder than necessary on the innocent pine logs. It was barely sunrise on this bitter February morning in 1867, but his anger had already filled their small home like smoke from a poorly built fire. Margaret pressed her face to the frost-covered window, watching Edmund's breath puff out in angry clouds. 3 days had passed since Dr. Henderson's visit, 3 days since the old man had shaken his head and delivered the news that made Edmund's face turn the color of fresh blood. No signs of a child coming, the doctor had said, gathering his black bag while avoiding Margaret's eyes. Perhaps it's time to accept that the Lord has other plans. Other plans. Margaret touched her flat belly through her wool dress, feeling the familiar ache of emptiness that had lived there for 5 long years of marriage. Every month brought the same cycle of hope and disappointment, the same questions from the church ladies, the same dark looks from Edmund when he thought she wasn't watching. In this territory where a man's worth was measured by his sons and his cattle, a barren wife was worse than useless. The coffee began to boil, filling the cabin with its rich smell. Margaret loved the morning ritual of grinding the beans, measuring the water, waiting for that perfect moment when the brown liquid turned from bitter to smooth. It was one of the few things left that brought her joy, one of the few tasks Edmund couldn't find fault with. She poured 2 cups, adding a spoonful of precious sugar to his, a small peace offering for whatever storm was building inside him. Through the window, she watched a lone rider approach from the north, leading a pack mule heavy with winter pelts. The stranger moved like he belonged to the mountains themselves, sitting his horse with the easy grace of someone who answered to nobody but the wind and weather. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, and even from a distance, she could see the confident way he held his head. "Company coming," she called to Edmund, but he just grunted and split another log with savage force. The stranger dismounted near their well, tipping his worn hat in her direction when he caught sight of her face in the window. Margaret stepped back quickly, her heart doing something strange and fluttery. She'd seen this man before twice a year. He came through the settlement, trading furs for supplies, spending his silver coins on flour and coffee and bullets. The other women whispered about him, calling him wild and dangerous. But Margaret had always noticed the gentle way he treated his animals, the quiet respect in his voice when he spoke to the shopkeeper's elderly mother. Edmund's axe finally stopped its angry rhythm. Margaret heard his heavy boots on the porch steps, heard him kick the snow off his soles before pushing through the door. His face was red from cold and fury, his pale eyes fixed on something far beyond their small cabin walls. "Caleb Morrison's back," Edmund said, pulling off his work gloves finger by finger. "Thought he'd moved on to California after last spring's trading." Margaret handed him his coffee, careful not to let their fingers touch. "Maybe the weather kept him here." "Weather," Edmund snorted, wrapping his large hands around the warm cup. "Man like that don't let weather decide his path. He's got reasons for staying, and I aim to find out what they are." Outside, Caleb was checking his mule's pack, making sure the ropes were secure. The morning sun caught the silver threads in his dark beard, and Margaret found herself wondering what it would be like to touch a face that held kindness instead of constant disappointment. The thought made her cheeks burn with shame. "He's just a trader," she said quietly, turning away from the window. "Probably needs supplies before heading west." Edmund's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. "Just a trader. Right." He moved to stand behind her, close enough that she could smell the wood smoke on his clothes, the sour tang of his morning breath. "You think I'm blind, Margaret? Think I don't see the way you watch him?" Her stomach dropped like a stone down a well. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you do." His voice dropped to that dangerous whisper she'd learned to fear. "Same way you watch every man who rides through here, wondering if he might take you away from all this. From me." Margaret turned slowly, keeping her expression as blank as possible. Edmund's pale eyes were studying her face like he was reading a map, looking for signs of the betrayal he was certain lived in her heart. His sandy hair stuck up in wild tufts from his work, making him look younger than his 32 years. But there was nothing boyish about the anger radiating from his stocky frame. "That's not true," she whispered. "Isn't it?" He set his coffee cup down hard enough to slosh brown liquid across the wooden table. 5 years, Margaret. 5 years of marriage and nothing to show for it but disappointment. You think I don't know what people say about us? About you? The words hit her like physical blows. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold back the tears that would only make things worse. Outside, she could hear Caleb talking quietly to his horse, his voice a gentle rumble that seemed to promise safety in a world full of sharp edges. "I've tried," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. "You know I've tried." "Have you?" Edmund stepped closer, and Margaret caught sight of the leather belt hanging from his pants, the same belt that had left purple marks across her back last month when she'd burned his cornbread. "Or have you been too busy dreaming about running off with the first stranger who smiles at you?" A knock at the door saved her from having to answer. Edmund's jaw tightened, but he smoothed down his hair and straightened his shoulders before walking over to lift the wooden latch. Caleb Morrison stood on their threshold like something out of a fairy tale, his storm-gray eyes taking in the scene before him with the sharp attention of a man used to reading danger in the wilderness. "Morning, Edmund." "Ma'am." He touched his hat brim when he looked at Margaret, and she felt that strange flutter in her chest again. "Caleb." Edmund's voice was carefully neutral. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon. Plans change." Caleb's gaze moved from Edmund's tense face to Margaret's carefully composed features, and she wondered what stories he could read in the shadows under her eyes, the way she held her left arm close to her ribs. "Wondered if you might have any supplies you'd be willing to trade. Coffee, maybe. Flour." Margaret started to speak, to offer him some of their precious stores, but Edmund's warning look stopped the words in her throat. "This was man's business," his expression said. "Stay out of it." But when Caleb looked at her again, really looked, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Recognition. Understanding. The kind of seeing that went deeper than polite conversation. "We might work something out," Edmund said slowly, still studying the mountain man's face. "Depends what you're offering in return." Caleb smiled then, a slow curve of his lips that transformed his weathered features. "I reckon that's a conversation worth having," he said. "But it might take some time to work out the details." As he spoke, his eyes found Margaret's once more, and in that brief glance, she read a promise that made her heart race with equal parts hope and terror. The trading post in Cedar Falls buzzed with the kind of excitement that only came when Caleb Morrison rode into town. Margaret watched from behind the pickle barrels as women found excuses to walk past the counter where he conducted his business, their voices pitched higher than usual, their laughter bright as newly minted coins. Even Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, had pinched color into her cheeks before venturing out to buy thread she clearly didn't need. "Shameless," muttered Mrs. Garrett, the blacksmith's widow, loud enough for half the store to hear. "Carrying on like schoolgirls over that wild man. Don't they know he's got Indian blood in him?" Margaret's fingers tightened around the handle of her shopping basket. She'd come to town for salt and lamp oil, nothing more, but finding Caleb here had changed the simple errand into something that felt dangerous and wonderful. 2 days had passed since his visit to their cabin. 2 days since Edmund had agreed to trade winter wheat for Caleb's promise to guide their neighbor's son safely to California come spring. "Indian blood don't make a man evil," said Lucy Chen, the Chinese shopkeeper's daughter who'd learned to speak her mind despite the whispers that followed her family. "Makes him know the land better than most white folks." Mrs. Garrett's face turned red as a turkey's waddle. "Well, I never. A heathen defending another heathen." "Ladies," Caleb's voice cut through their bickering like a knife through butter. Quiet but carrying the kind of authority that came from years of surviving in places where words mattered less than actions. "Perhaps we could keep the conversation friendly. Hate to see such pretty faces marred by ugly talk." His eyes found Margaret's across the crowded store, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. Edmund had ridden to the territorial capital on business, leaving her free to make the trip to town alone, a rare gift of solitude she'd planned to treasure. She hadn't expected to find herself caught in Caleb's steady gaze, hadn't prepared for the way her pulse quickened when he smiled. "Mrs. Hartwell." He touched his hat brim, the same polite gesture he'd shown the other women, but something in his tone made it feel personal. "Fine day for town business." Yes, she managed, acutely aware that every female eye in the store was fixed on their interaction. Just picking up supplies. Course you are. Mrs. Garrett's voice dripped with suspicion. Strange how you need supplies the same day certain folks happen to be in town. Margaret's face burned with embarrassment and anger. She'd done nothing wrong, nothing but exchange polite greetings with a man who'd shown her more courtesy in 2 minutes than her own husband managed in a month. But in a settlement where gossip spread faster than wildfire, even innocent conversations could fuel whispers that followed a woman to her grave. Mrs. Garrett. Caleb's tone remained pleasant, but something cold flickered in his gray eyes. Seems like you've got opinions about things that ain't your concern. Might want to consider how that reflects on your Christian charity. The older woman's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. Around them, the other customers suddenly became very interested in examining merchandise. But Margaret could feel their attention like heat from a forge. I should go, she whispered, clutching her basket tight enough to leave marks on her palms. No need to run off on my account, Caleb said easily. Still got business to finish here myself. But Margaret was already moving toward the door, desperate to escape before Mrs. Garrett's wagging tongue made something innocent into something shameful. She'd made it halfway across the store when Caleb's voice stopped her. Mrs. Hartwell. Almost forgot. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. Found this along the trail yesterday. Thought it might belong to someone from these parts. Margaret stared at the package, confusion replacing her embarrassment. She hadn't lost anything, hadn't even been on the trails recently. But Caleb's eyes held a message she couldn't quite read, an urgency that made her step closer despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. Thank you, she heard herself say, accepting the bundle with trembling fingers. No trouble at all. His fingers brushed hers as he handed over the package. A touch so brief it might have been accidental, but the warmth of it shot straight to her heart. Hope it finds its way to whoever needs it most. Outside the trading post, Margaret's hands shook as she unwrapped the paper. Inside was a small leather journal, its pages blank, except for a single line written in Caleb's neat handwriting. Some thoughts are too important for speaking aloud. Write them safe, where nobody can steal them away. Margaret pressed the journal to her chest, looking back through the store window to where Caleb was finishing his business with calm efficiency. He didn't glance her way again, but she could feel the connection between them like a rope stretched tight across dangerous ground. That evening, alone in her cabin while Edmund remained in the territorial capital, Margaret sat by lamplight and opened the journal to its first blank page. For years, she'd kept her thoughts locked inside her head, afraid that speaking them might give Edmund more ammunition for his anger. But here, in the privacy of written words, she could finally tell the truth. My name is Margaret Rose Hartwell, she wrote, the pencil feeling strange and wonderful in her fingers. I am 26 years old, and I have never felt more alone in my life. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam. Years of swallowed disappointment, months of walking on eggshells, weeks of wondering if the emptiness in her womb meant emptiness in her soul. She wrote about the bruises hidden beneath her sleeves, about the way Edmund's voice could turn her spine to ice, about the growing certainty that she was living someone else's life instead of her own. When her hand finally cramped from writing, Margaret looked up to find the lamp burning low and the fire reduced to glowing embers. Outside, wind rattled the shutters with the promise of another storm coming down from the mountains. But inside, wrapped in the warm circle of lamplight with her secret thoughts finally given form, Margaret felt something she'd almost forgotten how to name. She felt free. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring farm arrived before breakfast, her usually neat hair flying wild around her face, her wagon wheels throwing up clouds of muddy snow. Margaret, she called, not bothering to knock before bursting through the door. Thank the Lord you're here. It's Edmund. There's been an accident on the road to the capital. Margaret's blood turned to winter water. What kind of accident? Bridge gave way in the storm. His wagon went into Copper Creek. Mrs. Patterson's words came in breathless rushes. They pulled him out alive, but he's hurt bad. Doctor says he might not make it through the week. The journal slipped from Margaret's nerveless fingers, landing on the floor with a soft thud. All her secret thoughts, her dreams of freedom, Her growing feelings for a mountain man with kind eyes, all of it suddenly seemed as fragile as ice in springtime. "I have to go to him," she whispered. "Course you do. I'll drive you to town soon as you're ready." As Margaret gathered her things with mechanical efficiency, her mind raced through possibilities she'd never dared consider. If Edmund died, she'd be free, truly free, not bound by marriage vows or social expectations. She could sell the farm, maybe even accept Caleb's unspoken invitation to see what lay beyond the mountains that had become her prison walls. But as quickly as the thoughts came, shame followed. What kind of woman wished for her husband's death? What kind of wife felt relief at the news of his accident? The kind of wife who'd been beaten down so long she'd forgotten what hope felt like, whispered a voice that sounded suspiciously like Caleb's gentle wisdom. Margaret closed her eyes, picked up the journal, and prepared to face whatever came next. Blood pooled on the cabin floor like spilled wine as Margaret pressed a torn dish rag against the cut above her left eye. Edmund's wedding ring had opened the skin when his backhand caught her cheekbone, and now crimson drops fell steadily onto the pine boards she'd scrubbed clean just that morning. "Look what you made me do," Edmund said, flexing his knuckles while she dabbed at the wound. "All I asked was where you got that journal, and you had to lie to my face like I'm some kind of fool." Margaret's hand shook as she held the cloth to her head. She'd hidden Caleb's gift under the loose floorboard beneath their bed, wrapped in oilcloth like a precious treasure. But Edmund had found it anyway, had torn through their small cabin like a man possessed until he'd unearthed her secret thoughts. "It's just empty pages," she whispered, though they both knew that wasn't true anymore. 3 weeks of nightly writing had filled those pages with dreams and fears she'd never dared speak aloud. "Empty pages," Edmund laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Then why'd you write about wanting to leave me? About how that mountain man's got kind eyes and gentle hands?" Margaret's stomach turned to ice. She'd been so careful with her words, had thought her feelings were buried deep enough that only she could find them. But Edmund had always been good at reading the things she tried to hide. "I never wrote anything about Caleb Morrison," she said, hating how her voice trembled. "Caleb, is it?" Edmund grabbed her chin, forcing her to meet his pale eyes. "First names now. Real friendly for a married woman and a stranger." Outside, thunder rumbled across the Wyoming Territory sky, promising the kind of spring storm that could wash away roads and trap folks in their homes for days. Margaret found herself hoping for exactly that kind of weather, anything to keep Edmund from riding into town and causing the kind of trouble that would follow her to her grave. "Please," she said quietly. "I haven't done anything wrong, haven't you?" Edmund released her face and moved to the window, staring out at the darkening clouds. 5 years of marriage, Margaret. 5 years, and what do I have to show for it? No sons, no respect from the other men, and a wife who dreams about running off with the first stranger who tips his hat. Margaret pressed the cloth harder against her cut, using the pain to keep her thoughts clear. In her secret journal, she'd written about the bruises that painted her ribs purple, about the way Edmund's voice could make her flinch even when he was speaking softly. She'd written about wondering what it would feel like to wake up without fear, to speak her mind without calculating the cost. "I've been a good wife," she said, though even she could hear how hollow the words sounded. "Have you?" Edmund turned from the window, his sandy hair wild from running his hands through it. "Good wives give their husbands children. Good wives don't spend their evenings scribbling secrets in books given to them by other men." The accusation hung between them like smoke from a poorly built fire. Margaret had known this confrontation was coming from the moment she'd accepted Caleb's gift, had felt it building like pressure before a storm. But knowing hadn't prepared her for the way her heart hammered against her ribs, or the terrible certainty that whatever happened next would change everything. "What do you want me to say?" she asked. "I want the truth." Edmund moved closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, the sour scent of his unwashed shirt. "Did you write about him? About wanting to leave me?" Margaret closed her eyes, remembering the words she'd poured onto those pages. "I wonder what it would be like to be loved instead of owned, to be valued instead of tolerated." She'd written about Caleb's storm-gray eyes, about the way he'd looked at her like she mattered, like she was worth seeing. "Yes," she whispered. The word hit Edmund like a slap. His face went white, then red, then white again. For a moment, Margaret thought he might strike her again, might finally lose control completely. Instead, He grabbed the journal from the table and walked to the fireplace. "No!" Margaret lunged forward, but Edmund's other hand caught her wrist, squeezing until she cried out. "You want to keep your secrets so bad?" he said, holding the journal over the flames. "Then watch them burn." But before he could drop it into the fire, a knock echoed through the cabin, 3 sharp raps that made them both freeze. Edmund's grip on her wrist loosened, and Margaret pulled away, cradling her bruised arm against her chest. "Expecting someone?" Edmund asked, his voice deadly quiet. Margaret shook her head, though her heart had begun racing for an entirely different reason. Through the window, she could see a familiar silhouette on their porch, broad shoulders outlined against the storm-dark sky. "Mrs. Hartwell?" Caleb's voice carried through the wooden door, calm and steady despite the thunder rolling overhead. "Saw your lamp burning and thought you might need help securing things before this storm hits." Edmund's eyes narrowed to slits. "How thoughtful," he said, loud enough for Caleb to hear. "My wife and I were just having a discussion about thoughtful neighbors." Margaret bit her lip hard enough to taste copper. She could feel the danger crackling in the air like lightning, could see the fury building behind Edmund's pale eyes. Whatever happened next, someone was going to get hurt. The storm hit Cedar Falls like an angry fist, turning Main Street into a river of mud and trapping Margaret in the general store with half the settlement's women. 3 days had passed since Caleb's visit to their cabin. 3 days since Edmund had burned her journal page by page while she watched her written dreams turn to ash. "My stars, this weather," fretted Mrs. Patterson, peering out the rain-lashed windows. "Haven't seen flooding like this since 1862. Margaret pressed herself deeper into the corner behind the flour sacks, hoping to avoid the curious glances that had followed her since she'd arrived in town that morning. The cut above her eye had scabbed over, but the bruise spreading across her cheekbone told its own story to anyone willing to read the signs. "Margaret, dear?" called Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, her voice honey, sweet with false concern. "Come sit by the stove. You look positively frozen." But Margaret stayed in her corner, watching the storm rage beyond the windows and thinking about the terrible fight that had sent her fleeing to town. Edmund's rage had built for hours after Caleb left, fed by whiskey and wounded pride, until it exploded like a powder keg. This time, his fists had found targets his boots had missed, leaving her ribs aching and her left arm nearly useless. "Storm's got the creek running high as a church steeple," announced Frank Morrison, shaking rain from his coat as he pushed through the door. "Road to Denver's washed clean out. Won't be no travel for days, maybe weeks." Margaret's breath caught. Edmund had ridden toward the territorial capital that morning, carrying papers about selling their farm and moving somewhere. She couldn't embarrass him with her shameful behavior. If the roads were truly impassable, he'd be trapped wherever he'd taken shelter, unable to return until the waters receded. "What about the mountain trails?" asked Lucy Chen, looking up from where she was helping her father inventory damaged goods. "The high passes might still be clear." Frank shook his head. "Not in this weather. Even Caleb Morrison would have trouble getting through, and that man knows these mountains better than his own reflection." At the mention of Caleb's name, several women turned to look at Margaret with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. She felt heat climb her neck, remembering Mrs. Garrett's whispered accusations about her interest in the mountain man. "Speaking of Mr. Morrison," said Mrs. Garrett herself, materializing beside Margaret like a bad omen, "saw him riding hard toward the Hartwell place yesterday evening. Curious timing, what with Edmund being away and all." Margaret's stomach clenched. "I wouldn't know about that." "Wouldn't you?" Mrs. Garrett's eyes glittered with malicious pleasure. "Funny how some women always seem to need help when their husbands ain't around to provide it." "That's enough, Mrs. Garrett." Lucy Chen's voice cut through the older woman's implications like a knife through butter. "Storm's got everyone worried about their neighbors. Nothing shameful about checking on folks who might need assistance. But the damage was done." Margaret could feel the weight of feminine disapproval settling around her like a heavy cloak, could see the way conversations stopped when she moved closer. In a settlement where reputation mattered more than gold, even the suggestion of impropriety could follow a woman to her grave. The store door opened again, bringing with it a gust of wind and rain that made everyone shiver. Margaret looked up, expecting to see another storm-soaked settler, but instead found herself staring into Caleb Morrison's storm-gray eyes. He stood in the doorway like something out of legend, water streaming from his long coat, his dark hair plastered to his skull. His gaze swept the crowded store until it found Margaret's face, and she saw something fierce and protective kindle in his expression when he noticed her bruised cheekbone. "Ladies," he said, touching his hat brim in a gesture that somehow managed to be both polite and dismissive. "Mr. Chen, hope everyone's weathering the storm all right." "Well, as can be expected," replied the shopkeeper, clearly puzzled by Caleb's unexpected appearance. "Thought you'd be holed up in the high country until this passes. Had business in town." Caleb's attention remained fixed on Margaret, and she felt her pulse quicken despite her fear of the watching women, checking on folks who might need assistance. "Mrs. Garrett made a sound like a cat with its tail caught in a door. How thoughtful. Though I'm sure all the married ladies here are perfectly capable of waiting for their husbands to return." "Course they are," Caleb agreed easily. "Still, storms like this can be dangerous for folks on their own. Man would have to be pretty heartless to leave someone defenseless just because of what the gossips might say." The challenge in his words was unmistakable. Margaret watched the other women's faces, saw understanding dawn in their eyes as they realized this confrontation wasn't really about the weather at all. "Mrs. Hartwell," Caleb said, his voice gentle despite the tension crackling through the store, "wondering if you might need an escort back to your place. Roads are treacherous in this weather." Margaret's mouth went dry. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to protect herself from the scandal that would surely follow. But as thunder shook the building's frame and lightning illuminated the flooded street beyond, she found herself thinking about the empty cabin waiting for her, about the long hours she'd spend alone with her fear and bruises. "That's very kind," she heard herself say, the words coming from somewhere deeper than caution or common sense. Mrs. Garrett's gasp was audible above the storm's roar. "Margaret Hartwell, you can't seriously be considering—" "I'm considering accepting help from a neighbor during dangerous weather," Margaret interrupted, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Last I checked, that wasn't a sin." As she gathered her shawl and prepared to step into the storm with Caleb Morrison, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the store's rain-streaked window. The woman looking back at her had bruised skin and frightened eyes. But there was something new in her expression, something that looked almost like courage. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and Margaret wondered if she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life, or finally take the first step toward saving it. Edmund's fist connected with Caleb's jaw in the pre-dawn darkness, the sound echoing across the valley like a gunshot. Margaret screamed as both men crashed to the muddy ground beside Caleb's campfire, rolling and grappling with the desperate fury of wounded animals. "Thought you could steal my wife while I was gone," Edmund roared, his hands finding Caleb's throat. "Thought I wouldn't find out about your little rescue in the storm." Margaret pressed herself against a pine tree, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. Edmund had returned 3 hours ago, drunk and wild-eyed from whatever he'd heard in town about her riding home with Caleb during the flooding. She'd tried to explain, tried to make him understand that nothing improper had happened, but his rage had grown with each word, until he'd grabbed his rifle and headed for the mountain man's camp. Caleb twisted free from Edmund's grip and rolled away, coming up in a crouch with blood streaming from his split lip. "Settle down, Edmund. You're letting your temper cloud your judgment." "My judgment?" Edmund lunged again. But this time Caleb was ready. The mountain man sidestepped smoothly, using Edmund's momentum to send him sprawling face first into the dirt. "My judgment tells me you've been sniffing around my property like a dog in heat." Margaret watched in horror as Edmund scrambled for the rifle he dropped during their initial collision. Everything seemed to slow down Caleb's eyes, widening as he spotted the weapon, her own voice crying out a warning that sounded distant and strange, Edmund's trembling hands fumbling with the gun's mechanism. "Don't do this," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the barrel now pointed at his chest. "Whatever you think happened, you're wrong. Your wife is an honorable woman who deserves better than accusations and bruises." "Honorable?" Edmund's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "She wrote about you in that journal, about wanting to leave me for a stranger. What's honorable about that?" Margaret felt something snap inside her chest, not breaking, but straightening, like a bent wire finally resuming its proper shape. All her life she'd been told to stay quiet, to keep peace, to let men decide her fate while she stood silent in the shadows. But watching Edmund point a gun at the only person who'd shown her kindness, she realized that silence was just another kind of death. "Stop!" The word erupted from her throat with enough force to make both men freeze. "Put that gun down, Edmund Hartwell. Before I do something we'll all regret." Edmund's head swiveled toward her, his pale eyes wide with surprise. In 5 years of marriage, Margaret had never raised her voice to him, had never challenged his authority so directly. The shock of it seemed to rob him of speech. "You want to know what I wrote in that journal?" Margaret stepped out from behind the tree, her chin lifted despite the way her knees shook. "I wrote about being tired of walking on eggshells. I wrote about wondering what it would feel like to be valued instead of tolerated. I wrote about a man who looked at me like I mattered instead of like I was something broken that needed fixing." "Margaret," Caleb said quietly, but she held up her hand to stop him. "No, let me finish." She moved closer to Edmund, close enough to see the confusion and fury warring in his expression. "You want to shoot him for being kind to me? For treating me like a human being instead of livestock that disappointed you? Then you better shoot me too, because I'm the one who dared to imagine something better than this." The rifle wavered in Edmund's hands. "You don't mean that, don't I?" Margaret felt years of swallowed words rising in her throat like floodwater. 5 years, Edmund. 5 years of trying to be the wife you wanted, of blaming myself for not giving you sons, of pretending your anger was my fault. But I'm done pretending. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first fat raindrops began falling from the iron-gray sky. Margaret felt each drop like a baptism, washing away the fear that had kept her small and silent for so long. "You think I'm the problem?" Edmund's voice cracked like a whip. "You think I'm the reason we don't have children?" "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that maybe the good Lord knew better than to put babies in a house full of anger and broken dreams." The words hit Edmund like physical blows. His face went white, then red, then white again. For a heartbeat, Margaret thought he might turn the rifle on her instead of Caleb. Instead, he did something that surprised them all. He began to cry. The rifle fell from Edmund's hands as his legs gave out beneath him, sending him to his knees in the muddy campsite. His shoulders shook with sobs that seemed torn from somewhere deep inside his chest. Raw sounds that made Margaret's own throat tighten with unexpected sympathy. "I just wanted," he gasped between broken breaths, "I just wanted to matter to someone, to be the kind of man worth respecting." Margaret stared at her husband, really looked at him for the first time in years. Stripped of his rage and bluster, Edmund looked smaller somehow, younger, like the scared boy who'd courted her 7 years ago with stammered compliments and wildflowers picked from roadside ditches. She'd forgotten that version of him existed beneath the angry man who'd made her life a careful dance around his wounded pride. Caleb moved slowly to retrieve the rifle, keeping his movements calm and unthreatening. "Being worth respect ain't about forcing folks to fear you, Edmund. It's about treating others the way you'd want to be treated yourself." "Easy words," Edmund said bitterly, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "You don't know what it's like, having everyone in town whisper about your failures, having other men look at you like you're only half a man because your wife can't give you sons." Margaret felt her heart clench despite everything. She'd been so focused on her own pain that she'd forgotten Edmund carried wounds, 2 different ones, but just as deep. The realization didn't excuse his violence, but it helped her understand the fear that had driven him to lash out at everything he couldn't control. "Those whispers don't mean nothing," she said quietly, taking a step closer to where he knelt. "What matters is how we treat each other when nobody else is watching." Edmund looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "Do you love him?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Margaret glanced at Caleb, seeing the careful way he held himself still, giving her space to answer without pressure. His storm-gray eyes held understanding and something deeper, a patient affection that asked nothing but offered everything. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I know I can't keep living the way we have been. The anger, the fear, the way we hurt each other instead of helping, it's killing us both, Edmund. Slowly, maybe, but surely as any bullet." Rain began falling harder, turning the campfire to hissing steam and sending all 3 of them toward the shelter of Caleb's small lean-to. They huddled together in awkward silence, the smell of wet wool and wood smoke filling the cramped space. "There's something you should know," Edmund said finally, his voice hollow as an empty well, "about why I was so desperate for a son." Margaret waited, sensing this was important. "My pa," Edmund continued, staring at his muddy boots. "He left when I was 12, just packed up one morning and rode away without a word. My ma used to say it was because he was disappointed in me, because I wasn't the kind of boy worth staying for. The confession hit Margaret like cold water. She'd known Edmund's father had abandoned the family, but she'd never understood how deeply that wound had shaped her husband's desperate need to prove his own worth through children who might choose to stay. So, when you couldn't, Edmund's voice broke again. When month after month went by with no baby coming, I started thinking, maybe the problem was me. Maybe I wasn't the kind of man worth giving children to either. Caleb shifted beside them, his weathered face thoughtful. Children ain't proof of a man's worth, Edmund. They're gifts that come in their own time, if they come at all. Trying to force that gift just turns blessing into burden. But what if they never come? Edmund asked, the question carrying the weight of 5 years' worth of disappointment. Margaret reached out slowly, carefully, and touched her husband's hand. His fingers were cold and shaking, and she felt a stab of something that might have been the ghost of old love. Then we find other ways to matter, she said gently. Other ways to leave something good behind when we're gone. They sat in silence as the storm raged around their fragile shelter. 3 people who'd hurt each other trying to figure out how to heal. Outside, lightning split the sky like God's own judgment, illuminating a world washed clean and ready for whatever came next. When Edmund finally spoke again, his words were so quiet Margaret almost missed them beneath the rain. I don't know how to be different, he whispered. Neither do I, Margaret admitted. But maybe that's where we start, by admitting we don't have to keep being the same. The wagon wheels creaked a lonely rhythm as Margaret loaded her few belongings into the back. Each item a small decision about what mattered enough to carry into an uncertain future. 6 weeks had passed since that terrible night in the storm. 6 weeks of careful conversations and painful honesty that had slowly untangled the knots of anger binding her marriage. Take the good china, Edmund said quietly, wrapping her mother's teacups in newspaper with surprising gentleness. Always liked the way you served Sunday coffee in them. Margaret paused in folding her winter coat, studying her husband's face. The rage that had lived there for so long had faded, replaced by something sadder but cleaner, like a wound that had finally been allowed to heal properly. They'd spent weeks talking, really talking, about the dreams that had curdled into disappointment, the fears that had hardened into cruelty. You sure about this? She asked, though they'd discussed the decision a dozen times already. Edmund nodded, his sandy hair catching the morning light. We tried, Margaret. Lord knows we both tried. But some things just ain't meant to be, and holding on too tight only breaks them worse. Caleb emerged from the barn leading his horse, his movements careful and respectful. The 3 of them had worked out the details with the awkward politeness of strangers, navigating a difficult business transaction. Edmund would keep the farm and the livestock. Margaret would take her personal belongings and enough money to start fresh wherever the mountains led her. Papers are all signed, Caleb said, producing the divorce documents they'd drawn up with the circuit judge's help. Legal and proper, just like you wanted. In the Wyoming Territory of 1867, divorce was rare but not impossible, especially when both parties agreed to the separation. The judge had asked few questions after seeing Margaret's faded bruises and hearing Edmund's quiet admission that he'd failed in his duties as a husband. Folks in town are going to have plenty to say, Edmund said, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. About you leaving with him. About me letting you go. Margaret secured the last rope on her bundle, thinking about Mrs. Garrett's scandalized gasps when news of the divorce had spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. The whispers would follow them both for months, maybe years. But she discovered something important during those weeks of soul-searching. Other people's opinions couldn't hurt her unless she gave them permission. Let them talk, she said simply. We know the truth of it. A hawk circled overhead, riding the morning thermals with effortless grace. Margaret watched its flight and thought about the journal Caleb had given her all those months ago, the one Edmund had burned in his rage. She'd started a new one, filling its pages with thoughts about forgiveness and second chances, about the difference between love and habit. You take care of yourself, Edmund Hartwell, she said, meaning it more than she'd expected to. You too, Margaret. Edmund stepped forward as if to embrace her, then stopped himself, settling for a formal handshake instead. I hope you find what you're looking for out there. As Caleb helped her onto the wagon seat, Margaret felt a strange lightness in her chest, not the giddy excitement of escape, but something deeper and more solid. She was choosing her path, instead of having it chosen for her, and that made all the difference. The wagon rolled away from the cabin where she'd spent 5 years learning to make herself smaller, and Margaret didn't look back until they'd crested the first hill. When she finally turned around, she could see Edmund standing in the doorway, one hand raised in farewell, growing smaller and smaller until distance swallowed him entirely. "Any regrets?" Caleb asked as they headed toward the mountain passes that would take them beyond the reach of small-town gossip. Margaret considered the question seriously. "About leaving? No. About the years it took me to find the courage? Maybe. Courage ain't about how fast you find it," Caleb said wisely. "It's about finding it at all." Ahead of them, the mountains rose like promises against the endless sky. Spring came early to the high meadow where Caleb had built their cabin, painting the world in shades of green so vivid they made Margaret's heart ache with joy. She knelt in the rich mountain soil, planting the vegetable garden that would sustain them through the coming winter, her hands steady and sure as she tucked seeds into their dark beds. "Coffee's ready," Caleb called from the cabin porch, his voice carrying the contentment that had settled over both of them like a comfortable blanket during their first year as husband and wife. Margaret had married him in the autumn of 1867, in a simple ceremony performed by the same circuit preacher who'd granted her divorce from Edmund. No fancy dress or elaborate celebration, just two people promising to choose each other every day, to build something honest and good in this place where the past couldn't follow. "Just finishing the last row," she called back, tamping soil around the bean seeds with gentle fingers. A year of mountain living had changed her in ways both small and profound. Her hands were calloused now from real work, chopping wood, hauling water, helping Caleb with his trap lines during the long winter months. But more than that, she'd learned to trust her own voice, to speak her thoughts without calculating the cost in bruises or silence. Caleb appeared at her elbow with 2 steaming cups, settling beside her in the warm dirt with the easy companionship that had grown between them like something wild and natural. "Letter came yesterday," he said, pulling a folded paper from his shirt pocket. "From your friend Lucy." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron before accepting the letter, already smiling at the thought of news from the outside world. Lucy Chen had become her closest correspondent, sharing gossip and friendship across the miles that separated their very different lives. "Edmund remarried," Margaret read aloud, her voice steady despite the surprise. "A widow from Denver, with 3 young children. Lucy says he seems different, gentler, more patient. The children have brought out something good in him." She folded the letter carefully, thinking about the man she'd once promised to love and honor. The news brought no jealousy, only a quiet satisfaction that Edmund had found his own path to healing. Some people needed to break completely before they could rebuild themselves into something better. "Happy for him?" Caleb asked, his storm-gray eyes studying her face with the careful attention he'd learned to give her moods. "I am," Margaret said, and meant it. "We both deserve better than what we were giving each other. Maybe this way, we'll both find it." A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, and Margaret thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, scared, small, convinced that her worth was measured by what she could produce for others rather than what she carried inside herself. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone glimpsed through thick glass and half-remembered dreams. "Any word about your writing?" Caleb asked, nodding toward the new journal that never left her side. Margaret smiled, thinking about the stories she'd been crafting during the long winter evenings, tales of women who found their courage, men who learned to love without owning, children who grew up knowing their worth wasn't conditional on others' approval. A publisher in San Francisco had expressed interest in her work, had written that her authentic voice and unflinching honesty might find an audience among readers hungry for truth. "They want to see more," she said simply. "Seems there are folks out there interested in stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage." Above them, the hawk let out a wild cry, before catching an updraft and soaring higher, its wings spread wide against the endless blue sky. Margaret watched its flight and thought about all the women still trapped in cabins across the territory, still waiting for permission to become themselves. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, following her gaze. Margaret smiled, her face turned toward the mountains that had once seemed like prison walls but now looked like promises of adventures yet to come. "I'm thinking about how many stories are out there, waiting to be told." About how many people need to hear that their worth isn't determined by what others expect from them, but by what they're brave enough to expect from themselves. The hawk disappeared over the ridge, carrying her hopes toward horizons she couldn't yet imagine but was finally brave enough to seek. In the distance, church bells from the valley settlement marked the passing of another hour, another day, another chance to choose courage over comfort. Margaret Morrison rose from her garden, brushed the good earth from her hands, and went inside to write the next chapter of a story that was finally, truly her own.